Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I'm excited to present our first 3 FISH500 students. And I'm just going to explain you the format. So we have 3 talks. Each talk will be 12 minutes long, plus followed by a 2 to 3 minute time for questions. And we will start with John Driscoll, who is a first-year PhD student at the IRES, Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability. And yeah, welcome, John.
Thanks, Will. Is this, sounds good? Okay. So, yeah, I am in IRES, and my supervisor is Kai Chan, and at IRES, my intended field of PhD research is going to be in the kind of the intersection of fisheries and food security. But today, I'm going to talk about a project I was involved in before I came to UBC. So this project that I'm going to tell you about was essentially a 1.5-year long series of negotiations between the British Columbia groundfish bottom trawl fleet and several environmental organizations. The purpose of these negotiations was to develop a series of management measures to manage and reduce this fishery's impacts on sensitive benthic areas. There were 2 representatives from industry involved in these negotiations, Bruce Thuris and Brian Mose, and there were 2 from the environmental side, Scott Wallace, who is with David Suzuki Foundation, who got his PhD in this program, and myself, I was with Living Ocean Society at the time. So today I'm going to just kind of do a very unnecessarily brief overview of the background, the management measures we came up with, and some of the results we've seen in the 3 years since they've been implemented. So here on the coast of BC, there are approximately, at least 60 and perhaps more than 80 species of coral and approximately 250 species of sponge. Some of these species are of sort of substantial ecological importance due to the habitat that they provide for other species. So here on the left we see a rockfish associating with a large Primnoa coral, and on the right we see a rockfish and several invertebrates associating with a glass sponge. British Columbia is also home to a large bottom trawl fleet. The BC groundfish bottom trawl fleet is composed of approximately 70 vessels, which use bottom trawl gear to pursue a number of species, including flounders, soles, a variety of rockfish, and so on. And I should emphasize, this is not an image of, this is not gear that's actually used in BC. This is a general image right here, just to give a sense of what bottom trawl, what the gear looks like, how it's dragged along the bottom, and to show you how it can contact and damage the seafloor. The gear used in BC would be look quite a bit different. It'd be probably look heavier. So the science is science is very clear. And I'm sure that many of you are aware that bottom trawling is widely known to have the potential to cause significant and long-lasting damage to sensitive benthic habitats. So these images were taken by the Geological Survey of Canada in a sponge reef that's found off of the coast of BC. On the left we see an untrawled section of the reef, so notice the high degree of 3-dimensional structure formed by let's say a sponge right there, and there's some smaller sponges behind it. And on the right, that's an image taken on the same sponge reef that's been trawled or been hit by trawl. And so we see that that 3-dimensional structure has been either removed or utterly flattened. I see maybe the base of a large sponge is left, but otherwise it's been homogenized. And corals and sponges tend to be very long-lived and slow-growing, and so recovery from this type of damage, if it occurs at all, takes a year. So, like I said, the science is quite clear on this. Sponges and corals can be quite important ecologically, and they can be easily damaged by bottom trawling. Despite the clarity of the science, however, the British Columbia groundfish bottom trawl fleet has historically operated with essentially no management of their impacts on corals and sponge. With the exception of some spatial boundaries, a trawl closure around the glass sponge reefs, they have essentially otherwise been free to destroy corals and sponges without any kind of management action or limit on them. That's not to say that DFO Fisheries and Oceans Canada didn't recognize the problem. They've actually put out a decent amount of science and developed some policy and strategies to try to address this, but they never implemented these things, so they just kind of sat on the desk. And so the continued inactivity or inaction regarding this issue spurred several environmental organizations to take this cause up. So roughly between the years 2000 and 2010, several relatively prominent organizations made this a particular issue that they sought to raise awareness about, and they really sought to put pressure on both industry and government to reform this particular aspect of the fishery. However, for roughly that entire decade, there really wasn't much progress in terms of actual on-the-water change, and the relationship between the environmental organizations and industry became quite strained at times during this period. However, in 2010, the bottom trawl industry actually did decide to sit down with some environmental groups and to try to hammer out a path forward that was mutually acceptable to both sides. From an industry perspective, this was a way of improving their position in the marketplace. The market's increasingly requiring evidence of sustainability or movement towards sustainability. And for the environmental organizations, it was a good opportunity to actually get some real-world on-the-water change, especially in a time when the political winds seemed to be blowing away from doing anything like that. So it was a good opportunity. So so between 2010 and 2012, there was a series of negotiations, a number of them, and meetings and going over data, et cetera, and the results were a suite of management measures that were finalized in early 2012 and then implemented via the Fisheries management plan in early 2012. So there were several management measures that were developed, and I'm going to focus on two today. The first one was what is known as freezing the trawl footprint. Basically, it was defining the boundaries within which the trawl fishery could operate. And what we did to define the trawl boundaries is we basically started with charts of their historically trawled area since 1996. And from those charts, we then negotiated boundaries about where they could trawl and where they couldn't. The primary purpose of the freezing the footprint effort is to prevent expansion of the fishery into previously untrawled areas, because that's where when they expand previously untrawled areas, that's where the damage happens. And as well, there was some degree of reduction of trawling in sensitive habitats that we were able to accomplish through drawing the boundaries. For the most part, it was to prevent expansion into untrawled areas. The second measure that I really want to draw attention to, because I think it's kind of unique, is we developed and implemented individual vessel limits on coral and sponge bycatch. So this is essentially individual transferable quotas, or ITQs, for coral and sponge. And as far as we know, this is the first fishery in the world that has ITQs, or a quota system, specifically for coral and sponge, for the purpose of managing habitat impacts. It's been proposed in the literature, but we don't know of any other fishery that's actually gone ahead and implemented it. And at this point, I should point two things out about this fishery that are very important, and I bet you half of you are having these thoughts right now. So hopefully these 2 points will answer some questions. First of all, this fishery has long been an ITQ fishery. So the management of its target species since the 90s has been via ITQs. So there's an existing ITQ program that already existed, and we could just plug coral and sponge right into it. So that was very important. And secondly, and maybe even more importantly, this fishery has long also had 100% at-sea observer coverage. So every trip that is out there, there is a third-party human observer who is tasked with weighing, identifying, and reporting all the catch. So that's very important to know. So essentially, once we put these measures into the fishery management plan in early 2012, they became mandatory. They're not voluntary. And so the idea was essentially that these vessel limits on coral and sponge catch would create a significant economic disincentive that would really encourage individual skippers to avoid at all costs corals and sponges where they knew they existed. Because basically what would happen is if they went over their individual limits, they would have to either lease some from another vessel, and nobody's going to be very quick to give up their limits because they don't get very much, or they'd be shut down. They wouldn't be able to fish. So a fairly strong incentive to not catch corals and sponges. And what we really wanted to do was to develop a mindset amongst the skippers whereby they would think of the location of corals and sponges every single time they set down their net, every time. And ultimately, all these measures were meant to achieve this management target of no more than 884 kilograms combined coral and sponge catch for the entire fleet for an entire year. We got that number, that's basically the lowest number, the lowest total catch of coral and sponge that the fleet achieved, I think, in a 16-year time period. And so we saw that as being the lowest number that they could, kind of like the most minimum number they could achieve while still functioning. So we chose that as the upper management target. So so these measures were implemented once again in 2012, and so now we've had 3 years to see how they've been working. We'll get to some results now. The first result, and an important one, is so far in the first 3 years of the program, the catches of coral and sponge have been substantially less than the management target. So the management target is the constant on all three of those, all three of the graphs right there, or all three of well, whatever. It's set at 884 kilograms. And so as you can see, the actual catch of coral and sponge has been quite a bit less and has actually been declining every year that this program has been in existence. And just for a reference, on the left here, the leftmost part of the x-axis, what this is, that is the average of the largest single toe catches of coral and sponge recorded each year between 1997 and 2011. So basically, every once in a while, during that period, there would be these single toes, single passes of the net, where they would catch tremendous amounts of coral and sponge. And that is the average of each year's biggest single toe. So you compare 2012, 2013, 2014, those are for the entire year, entire fleet. And those, that average on the left there is for the largest single toe by one vessel, one day. Additional results. Okay, all right. So yeah, so moving on. These are kind of the catch, the weight frequency distribution of the coral and sponge catches we've seen. So you can see that the mean and the maximum catch of coral and sponge has declined substantially before and after implementation. So 2010 is before, 2013 is after. But what I think is particularly interesting is how in 2013, after the implementation, you don't really see these catches over 10 kilograms of corals. You don't see those big catches anymore. So what this suggests to me is that these little 1 kilogram catches are still occurring. Those are kind of one-off things where the skipper may not have known that anything was down there. But the removal of these kinds of big catches suggests to me that this is having an effect, and skippers are perhaps avoiding areas that they know have coral and sponge in them. So those numbers suggest that these measures have, since the implementation of the measures, coral and sponge catch has been lower than recent historical levels. But I think that there is at least one more important question that we have to answer if we're considering the effectiveness of these measures, and that is how well are they protecting areas of known coral and sponge abundance, high abundance. So during the negotiations, we didn't get everything we wanted. And one of the things we wanted from the environmental side was removal of these 12 high-risk areas that you see here in yellow. These are areas that historically have very high trawl bycatch, coral and sponge bycatch. We wanted those removed. Industry was adamant that they had to stay in. So then the question is, what has coral and sponge bycatch looked like in these hotspots since? And when we look at the numbers for the first 2 years, we see that in 5 areas there's been no trawling whatsoever in the hotspots. And 2 other places there has been trawling, but there's been no coral or sponge bycatch. However, that does also mean that in 5 spots there has been trawling and there has been coral and sponge bycatch. So that's an important thing to consider. So just wrapping up very quickly here. Just a summary, since the implementation of these measures in 2012, this is what we've seen. Coastwide coral and sponge catches have been very low relative to historic levels. Large catches of coral and sponge seem to be strongly reduced, essentially eradicated. Some high-risk areas may be being avoided. There may be market reasons for that or other reasons, but some high-risk areas are not being fished in. Others, though, are still yielding coral and sponge bycatch. And the last thing I would say in conclusion, specifically to the point of using individual vessel quotas to manage coral and sponge catch, I think that the first couple of years of results suggest this might be a possible way forward. I think there's still a lot more work to be done to check that out. 2 things, though, is that it's going to require 100% at-sea observer coverage. It can't be a voluntary program. And secondly, it may not protect all high-risk areas at all times. And I think that second point is really interesting, and I'd be happy to talk about it and why that may be true at the end. These are some many people who worked on the project, or are, in the case of Dr. Gordon Monroe, who's here, or he's not in the room, but he's helping us write a journal article that we should be submitting very soon.
Okay, we have a couple minutes for questions.
Sorry, I didn't see you.
I'm wondering about the other side of this trade-off for protecting these corals and sponges. Did you evaluate any performance metrics for the fishing fleet?
We have not yet, no. And this was the good side of dealing with of having their negotiators right there, is that they had one of the guys we were negotiating with was a highly successful skipper, and so we basically relied on them. They took it back to their guys, and they would discuss how these things were going to affect. And the degree of of accuracy they had when they were talking about specific areas. Oh, no, we have to fish in that 1 square kilometer area. It was really impressive. But as far as how we actually looked at the data since then, no, we haven't done that. And we hope to, but it takes a while to get to the data.
I'm just wondering how strong the connections are between coral and sponge health and the health of the ground fish population, and how big of a role that plays in negotiations.
It's a hard question to answer. Verena Tunnicliffe and Dupree, her last name is Dupree, said she was a graduate student at, I guess they're at UVic, had done some pretty interesting work on trawled areas versus non-trawled areas in Learmonth Bank. And they found the species composition is very different for commercially important crawfish species. As far as a leverage point or as a discussion point, I think that these guys, they know it. But in a way, it's a tragedy. How is it a tragedy? It wasn't the strongest leverage point that we had. So it's something that people have been saying for years and years and years and years. And that's not what got them to the table, nor is it what got them to give up anything, unfortunately.
One last short question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a question about like the numbers that you gave, like you quoted the lowest, like one of those figures was about 884 or something like that, and then highest to like 2,500 kilograms. That seems like such a big disparity in my head, but like one sense I want to get is what sort of spatial area is that? Like, do you think that might cover like 2,500 seeds that can spread itself over a large area?
Those 2,500 came. That was the average of, those were all in one tow.
Yeah.
So that wasn't over the course of a year or even over the course of the coast. That was one trawl tow.
Right.
Whereas the 884 was the lowest over the entire coast. So yeah, so I try to make it clear. It's actually hard for me to express in only a few minutes. Most of the numbers were coast-wide, except for those individual, that one graph that showed the one average of the individual tows. Those numbers are shocking. The coast-wide catches in those years were far larger than that. I just thought that was particularly shocking to see one tow be that high.
Okay, thank you, Don. Okay, so our next speaker is Rebecca Singleton. And Rebecca joined the Fisheries Economic Research Unit last year in September and is doing her PhD under the supervision of Rashid Sumaila. Welcome, Rebecca.
Okay, so from my very first slide, at least half of the Fisheries Centre would probably dismiss me as a bunny-hugging conservationist. Those of you who know my background will know that before I came here, I spent nearly 10 years working as a trial lawyer in London for some very big and scary corporations, so bunny-hugging isn't really in my repertoire. But I wanted to talk today about this perception of conservation work as being kind of soft and fluffy and ineffective, and what we as researchers can do to inject some more rigour in the process. Hence the full title of my talk, Saving Nemo Without Bunnies. So I'm particularly interested in marine conservation in developing countries. And as many of you will know, the classic model for many years there has to be create a marine protected area. But what does that give us? Well, without compliance on its own, it just gives us a line in the water, so to speak. And actually, traditionally, a lot of marine protected areas have been created in these places by foreign NGOs. And they come in and they ask the local community basically to make a leap of faith and to comply with the area and limit their activities and maybe limit one of their sources of food in order to hope that this marine protected area will do its magic and at best in a few years start to enhance their fisheries. Now, unsurprisingly, that's a pretty hard sell in these places, and so the classic model quickly moved on to models where there was an attempt to provide benefits to local communities, and typically this would be something like an ecotourism project. Unfortunately, at least originally, these things weren't particularly well thought out either in terms of where the benefits went to. And there are a lot of examples in the literature of ecotourism projects where the benefits went to an overseas owner, or where perhaps the only benefit is enhancing biodiversity in the marine protected area, which benefits the American billionaire who believes that's a good thing. Or perhaps the benefit goes to the offshore trawler who is having their activities unlimited because the government's fulfilling its conservation objectives closer to shore. So this classic model of imposing protected areas with or without some sort of attempt at economic benefits has never really been that successful in developing countries. And you'll often find that these areas are difficult to enforce, or if they can be enforced, then maybe they fall apart when the NGO that implemented them leaves. So, and they've also, this kind of measure has also brought condemnation down a little bit on the conservation community, in the sense that it's kind of a bit of a colonial approach. People with, from say American-based or English-based NGOs going around the world and imposing marine protected areas. So with those criticisms in mind, the field moved on to try and integrate conservation work with human development work, both out of respect for the local communities where these things were happening, but also with the idea that if there were development benefits to marine protected areas and other conservation efforts, then perhaps they would be more palatable to local communities and be more effective. So, for example, on the treaty level, the Convention on Biological Diversity has commitments to alleviate poverty. On the flip side, the development treaties and the Millennium Development Goals have commitments to environmentally sustainable development. On the ground level, there are a number of projects now where there'll be, for example, a conservation initiative that might bring health benefits or education benefits as well. And research now, there are a lot of research projects where the researchers go into the local communities and talk to them about what it is that they want and need for a successful, dignified, fulfilled life. So you'll hear a lot about well-being-based fisheries research and human rights-based fisheries research these days. My concern is that neither of these approaches are working on the right scales to bring about real effective change. So on the one side, we have our big treaty commitments and the UN, who have a lot of power perhaps, but these commitments don't necessarily understand what's happening on the ground in individual communities, and also don't necessarily even trickle down that far. They often don't even really make it into national laws. On the other side, we have our projects in the local fishing communities, which understand really well what people want, but don't necessarily have the power outside of those communities to achieve it. And I would say that going into a community and asking people what they want without having any ability to actually achieve that for them often does more harm than good. So we need to think really carefully about how we link up these two ends of the scale in terms of both knowledge and power. My other concern is also the sharks in the water. Although there's a lot of talk about sustainable development these days, some of the indications are that some of the big NGOs are actually still targeting their sort of colonial style imposition of marine protected areas and other conservation measures. And so we need to watch out for these hidden agendas that might be undermining the system. So, back to my thesis, what are we going to do about this? Well, going back to my former career, contrary to popular belief, or at least Daniel's not here today, but Daniel's belief, I did not spend the majority of my time prancing around court in a wig. So I did spend the majority of my time getting to know the industries that my clients operated in, getting to know the pressures that my clients were facing, and trying to understand the relationship between my clients and their opponents in cases. And that kind of understanding of context really helps you to identify points where there might be ground for settlement or points to undermine your opponent's position. So for example, I would have some cases where my clients and their opponent just simply hated each other, and it was never going to settle no matter what the legal merits. I had other cases though, perhaps, where my client had just not quite got the royalty percentage that they wanted in royalty negotiations, and they were going to court simply to put pressure on the other side, and there was fertile ground for settlement there. And then I had other cases where it would turn out, after a little bit of digging, that the other side was flat broke, and they were really bringing the case just to try and shake down some money out of my rich corporate client. So you can see that until you if I'd just looked at the law, if I hadn't understood the background picture, I wouldn't have really known what was going on in the case. And I think that marine conservation can benefit from this similar sort of investigative picture building kind of work. So I'm going to go back to basics and ask the really simple who, what and why questions. So I'll be asking things like, who is funding marine conservation? Is it NGOs? Is it developed country governments? Or is it actually private companies these days to a certain extent? I'll be asking who benefits in local communities. Is anybody locally benefiting? If they are, is there a difference between the fishermen and the fisherwomen and the children? I'll also be asking what the benefits are. So traditionally, a lot of projects have targeted purely financial benefits. And I'll be asking whether we also need to look at other aspects of poverty, aspects of empowerment, health, education. And I'll be asking what the funders, the NGOs, whoever, do when they go into communities to try and implement these conservation projects. Who do they work with? What do they do to try and, if anything, to try and make sure the projects last beyond their involvement? And finally, most importantly, I'll be asking why. Why do we have the marine conservation projects that we do today? Are they based on sound research and theory? Are they based purely on what the funders want? And are they based at all on what the people in the developing communities want? So my research methods may get a little bit grey and corporate at times. It's amazing, this is just to show you, it's amazing what you can find out in company accounts. A lot of people don't know that most companies, including a lot of NGOs, publish an awful lot of information every year about themselves and what they're doing. I'll also no doubt be synthesizing a lot of the sort of conservation, marine protected area case studies that have gone before. And I think a really critical part of my project will be to interview the key players, whether they be people who work for NGOs, a member of the Philippines government, or a fisherman in a community. And I think only when we start doing this kind of picture building, investigative work, and really understand what's happening and how it affects communities and what's driving it, can we understand why perhaps marine conservation hasn't really been so effective to date, and hopefully find ways to improve it. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be glad to take them.
Any questions?
Yeah. So I'm just wondering about if in your research you'll be looking at differences between, we have seen an increase, or somewhat of an increase over the past decade of communities implementing or beginning the process of implementing MPAs, and then seeking support through higher levels of government or reaching out to NGOs to do implementation plans and stuff like that. Will you be kind of comparing what have been the social processes and outcomes between MPAs that were, maybe established from a very outside NGO community versus ones that have been a little bit more collaborative, however successfully?
Yeah, I will. And I think even those, I think one of the problems with those local-based MPAs is that they're fine to a certain extent, like maybe the community through peer pressure or whatever can control their own activities. But then, like you said, they have to start reaching out to government when they have to deal with fishing boats that come in from outside, or when they have to deal with, a lot of the issues I'm going to be looking at are completely outside of fishing, because, for example, they wouldn't be able to deal with a development or a forest clear cutting or whatever that led to sedimentation in the waters that they're fishing. And so I think the whole project is really about linking up those sort of local level projects and the ones imposed by NGOs and trying to align the objectives, trying to align what people want. And yeah, it will be interesting to see how those projects try and expand out versus how.
One more question?
Just out of curiosity, do you have a target area that you're going to be looking at, or a target group, like, I don't know, like a country, a continent?
No, I'll probably be starting with coral reefs, just because that's what I know from my master's projects. But potentially, and to be honest, like the initial kind of digging and querying will be which of the major NGOs, which of the major foreign governments are getting involved. So it's going to be a very big global picture, and then I might see them on the I think we have to move on after we have more time. Thank you, Rebecca. Our next speaker is Allison Witter. Allison is also a first-year PhD student with Rashid Sumaila in the Fisheries Economic Research Unit. She's originally from Victoria, BC, so local, more or less. And welcome, Allison.
So good morning. Thank you all for being here for our talks. Today I'm going to speak about local seafood and community-supported fisheries in North America. This was the subject of my master's thesis research, and I will continue to explore this for my PhD here with the Fisheries Economics Research Unit. In particular, I've identified a few key research gaps that I'd like to look into, so I'm just going to brief you on those and then describe a couple of the projects that I'm collaborating on right now that are starting to look into those research gaps. So just to begin, what is driving the local seafood movement, which is essentially aiming to reconnect seafood producers and consumers in North America? On the supply side, there are several drivers. They mostly have to do with challenges to small-scale fishermen staying in business. For example, impacts of fisheries policies such as ITQs or catch shares and the resulting consolidation, prices of quota, etc., that make it difficult for independent fishermen to stay in the game year after year. Other factors such as high costs of operation and uncertainty when someone goes out for a season and comes back and isn't sure what they will receive in terms of price and how much they will be able to sell in terms of volume at the dock. All of this has led to a decreasing value of fishing operations. On the other hand, cheap imported seafood products are sort of a competitive force for smaller scale fishermen, so a lot of them are looking to differentiate themselves somehow, but they can't necessarily receive or achieve MSC certification because of their small operations. So on the demand side, there are other factors as well that are leading this movement towards local seafood. The more broad local food movement is having people try to reconnect to the source of their food, and then with regards to seafood specifically, people might be wanting to eat sustainable seafood, but they are a bit confused about the different ranking guides or the differences between different certification and labeling schemes. So this combined with weak traceability and more global seafood supply chains and the resulting imposter fish scenario or mislabeling of seafood has all sort of led towards this movement. So what does it look like? Essentially, the local seafood movement is trying to adapt seafood supply chains, make them a bit shorter and localized or regional. So here we have two supply chains for seafood. On the top, a more conventional one. These are just basic depictions, but essentially what it's showing you is that in a more conventional and often global supply chain, the fisherman will land at the dock and sell to a buyer who may also be a processor, and then the fish changes hands several times before reaching a consumer as they buy the seafood in a retail setting. In a more, this is sort of the ideal version of a local seafood chain, the fisherman as an individual or as a group attempts to absorb all those supply chain functions into perhaps a cooperative or a company in order to capture more profits from the supply chain with the aims of having higher prices received by the fishermen, and in some cases, which is interesting to look at, making the seafood cheaper to seafood consumers at the end. So an example of how people are trying to reach this goal towards more local seafood systems is the community-supported fisheries model. Some of you may have heard of Skipperato's CSF in town or been to their Sean and Sonia's talk earlier this year. Essentially, CSFs are based on community-supported agriculture, in which a consumer becomes a member of the food production system. And how do they do that? They invest in that food production system by prepaying for a share of whatever food is produced that season. So in doing that, they are helping to cover working capital costs at the beginning of the season. In the case of fishing, this could be to help with boat repairs or buying licenses or gear upgrades. This helps to distribute the production risk, and it also helps to just guarantee a sales volume and fair price for fishermen at the beginning of the season before they go out. So what is this looking like in North America right now? There's been a growth in the number of CSFs on the continent since 2007, when the first one was started in Port Clyde, Maine. So you can see there's been a growth in the total number of these programs. Interestingly, last year there were around 42 CSFs, and at the beginning of this year there are also 42. These numbers capture both new CSFs and ones that have gone out of business. So I believe 2 or 3 new CSFs have already launched this year. However, a few went out of business last year. So that's just what these numbers are showing. What does this look like in terms of range? This is just a map showing the locations that are served by CSFs. Not where the CSFs are located, but all the locations served by them, which is around 187 locations currently. And in Canada, there are around 4 CSFs supplying 14 locations. So with the case of Skipper Autos, these guys are supplying not just in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, where they're based, but they also have members in the interior and the prairies. So overall, there's been a lot of praise for these programs. People in the news are saying, you know, this is a way to promote resilient fishing and to help sustain sustainable fishing practices in smaller scale fisheries, that it's good for community development, that it's good for traceability of seafood and transparency. On the other hand, some people are calling it a food trend. So that leads me to question, is this just a niche market, something that's trendy amongst the farmers market crowd, or could it be something more? So there is some research on CSFs and the actual impacts of this model that sort of backs up some of the praise. It's quite limited though. There are about 3 scientific papers thus far, each with a different focus on the impacts of CSFs. It's just a summary of some of the opportunities that they've found of the model. There are market benefits to this model in general in terms of providing higher prices to fishermen, helping them to stay in business. There are also some non-market benefits, such as political capital, as more fishermen come together in cooperatives and then also start engaging more with local communities. This can add more leverage in fisheries management. And then in terms of the ecological impacts of this model, there's actually just one study that's looked into this. And what it found was that while the target stock sustainability of the fisheries supplying these CSFs is on average actually about the same as North American fisheries more generally, there are some other ecological gains that could be had, including lower carbon footprint and food miles, as you would imagine, and other things such as providing new markets for underutilized but abundant species in certain locations, and also potentially by providing higher values for certain fish, promoting lower volume fishing. At the same time, there are a lot of challenges that have been identified with this model. So in terms of the profitability of these companies, some of them struggle to stay afloat. Like I mentioned, there are always a few going out of business each year. And often it's difficult for these companies to pay their employees a fair wage. They often rely on volunteer labor. They may also rely on grant money. They may not be self-sustaining as a business themselves. It can also be tricky to vertically integrate all these components of a seafood supply chain into one business, as the model ideally attempts to do. So for a fisherman to go and all of a sudden be also in charge of processing and then cold storage and transportation, as well as marketing and consumer support, that's a lot to do. So to actually make it happen, it requires a lot of human and physical capital. There are some other challenges, but overall the question is, are the theoretical benefits of this model actually realizable in practice? So this just leads me to what I see as the two main research gaps on CSFs. First of all, what is their economic viability? And second of all, are they scalable and to what degree? So I'm just working on 2 projects that are in their preliminary phases right now, collaborating with some people that we're trying to address these 2 questions. So first of all, I'm working with a team of SFU researchers. We are surveying CSFs across North America to see some key components of their business structures, as well as some financial success metrics in order to find out if there are certain criteria of these businesses that can lead to economic success. Secondly, and I think one of the really interesting questions here is the scalability of the model. So the project that I'm collaborating with some people at the Institute for Coastal Research on Vancouver Island is how might these programs help in meeting the economic diversification goals of coastal rural communities on BC's north coast. Through the Marine Planning Partnership process, 4 sub-regional strategic plans were established last year for the area, and in them there's quite a heavy focus on moving towards community-based fisheries and strengthening local seafood systems. So we just want to see if this model could help in the implementation of these goals. But beyond that, I think it would be really interesting to look at the scalability of the model in terms of how big can one CSF get? Is it just a stepping stone to something else, such as restaurant-supported fisheries, which we've been seeing, or institution-supported fisheries, or just local seafood systems more generally? And then also, this phenomenon is mostly occurred in North America. There are a few CSFs elsewhere, such as 2 in the UK, and 1 in Germany and 1 in Chile, actually, as far as I know. There may be more. So the second question is this just something that fits within a North American context, or could it be adapted to other parts of the world? So I just want to thank the people who have supported me on my research so far, Rashid Samaila, my supervisor, the people I'm collaborating with at SFU and Vancouver Island University, and then the Strobels at Skipperato's CSF. Any questions?
Questions? Lots of digest and 3 talks in a row. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
No, it's okay. I think we should. It's fine. I can ask
Talk
you.
later.
I can ask you. Oh, what? Are you guys waiting for a model or what? No. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go.
Yeah, thanks.
You always come. It's good. When you are in town, you always come. It's great.